Chapter 1. An Unbearable Beginning. From the age of about 5 or 6, I can remember my old man beating me. He was a right mean old bastard, and nothing ever seemed to please him. There are probably loads of other people that have been through what I went through, and it affects many of us in different ways. But here is a little bit of what happened to me, and what moulded me into who, or shall we say what, I am today. From being a kid, I learned not to look at him. If he was in a mood or somebody else had upset him, whether they knew it or not, if they knew what was going to happen to me, they probably wouldn't have bothered. If he was eating and you looked at him, and not necessarily in the wrong way, he would throw his food at you, or drag you over to it and stick your face straight in it like a disobedient dog. His aim was to degrade you, and that had the desired effect on me. Then later on, he began to beat me properly. Again like that disobedient dog, and for little reason. From being about 10 years old, or possibly 11, I can't quite remember exactly, but it was around the same time, I started at Dyke House Senior School in Hartlepool. It was also around this time he bought an allotment down Sands End near our home. I was made to go down daily and dig it over, and then when I'd finished, I'd head over to the beach and collect sea coal for the house and the allotment. Not many people know what sea coal is, but basically it's coal that washes up on the beaches. There are exposed beds of coal on the sea floor, and after storms at sea, it washes up and can be found along the high tide line. Well, I was one of the few who knew all about sea coal, especially if there was none to be found on the beach on any given day, which was often the case. When there was no sea coal, I would get bashed, and I mean bashed, for what he said was not trying hard enough. Trust me, I didn't want bashing, and I tried. There simply wasn't any to be found half the time. The average kid didn't even know what it was, and here I was getting bashed for not being able to find any. Then to make it worse, he made friends with some of the other allotment people, and he would lend them to me for a day or two to dig their allotments and get their sea coal, for which he'd no doubt be getting backhanders for the privilege, and I'd still get my beatings, no matter who did or didn't get their sea coal. I remember on a weekend I had to be up and ready for 8 o'clock in the morning so that I could be at the allotment as soon as it got light, and I was usually still there when it got dark. It might sound crazy, but I loved the winter because it got dark early, so I had a shorter working day. But on the downside, it was more hard work on the beach getting cold. My fingers used to be numb, and I'd lose all feeling, and half the time I couldn't pick the damn stuff up, even when I had found it. I remember clearly if I complained, he used to make me hold my hands under the hot tap. He was kind like that. The freeze burn was intense. It used to really hurt. Then he'd send me off to bed. If he'd had a drink, I used to just go out the room and go straight up to my bed. I knew I was getting battered whether I'd done anything wrong or not, so walking off wasn't going to make things any worse. I remember one time he kicked me in the balls and my right ball went about 6 inches up towards my stomach. I had to have an operation to get it back down, and have a beauty of a scar to prove it. His favourite punishment was to send me to the back door to collect his belt. It was one of the army belts with the 2 buckles on the back. I had to take it to him so he could belt me with it. If my mum tried to stop him, she would get it as well. I can remember her taking the belts for me quite a few times. She's dived on top of me loads of times, and I've heard her crying and saying to him, "You're going to kill that lad." I heard him say, "So fucking what, he's not mine." He would often say that, because he was in the army when I was born. But it wasn't the case. I think it would be fair to say he just didn't like me because I looked like my mum's side of the family and not his. Dad was always very nice to my brother George, because he was named after him and looked like him. George has turned out to be just like him in life as well. There were 9 kids in my family, and I was the oldest. I remember one night my mum and Dad had been out boozing, and my mum came in the house first, and she was limping. I thought he'd hit her again, but she only had one high-heel shoe on. The other one was embedded in her head. I attacked him, but I was only 13, and he kicked fuck out of me. I woke up the next morning covered in blood. I remembered I couldn't eat for a few days, or have salt on me food as it stung my mouth and lips too much. Another time, he was going to the club and said, "Polish my shoes." So I did to stop any arguments. He put them on and he noticed a mark on them, and made me get on me hands and knees and wipe it off. Then he bent down and kicked me so hard in the ribs that it broke 2 of them. I couldn't breathe because of the intense pain. He just laughed and started poking me in them with his other foot. When he went out, my mum said, "Go and stay at your friend's house, Ralphie Young." When his mum seen the state of me, she took me to the hospital. That's how I knew they were broken. Another time, my mum and Dad had been out drinking. He said she looked at another man and punched her in the face, and she was unconscious. He put a leg on the chair and stamped on it. I heard it break, and I attacked him again, but he just beat me like a dog. The next morning, I had bruises everywhere. There wasn't a bit of my body that didn't hurt after that. Every time he had a drink, he used to take me in the back garden and fight me like a man. At first I used to cry, hoping he would stop, but it just made him worse. I don't know how, but I just got to a stage where I didn't feel it anymore. The only thing good about it was that it took most of the beatings off me mum. I never got any time to play with my friends when I was a bairn. One day my friend Danny came for me to see if I was going out, but my dad answered the door and shouted me. So I went out the door and he picked me up by the hair. Then he threw me at the iron gate, then picked the brick gate post up and dropped it on me leg. It snapped like a twig. It fucking hurt for weeks after that. The bastard was a monster. It was Christmas time I really dreaded. Children love Christmas. It's such a magical and special time. But I thoroughly hated that, because it was drink, drink and more drink with him. I knew all I would be getting was bumps and bruises. One Boxing Day, he'd gone out early with my mum, and they went to a party. They came in about 5 a.m. I'd put all the kids to bed, but I fell asleep and the fire had gone out. He sent my mum to bed and woke me up. He gave me one of the worst hidings I've ever had. Then he made me take all my clothes off and chucked me out to the back door and locked it. There was 6 inches of snow on the floor, and it was hailstoning. I was fucking freezing. I couldn't go anywhere with no clothes on. So I got into the dog kennel and snuggled up to the dog to get his body warmed, and it fucking stunk. I didn't get back to the house until he had gone back out on the drink, which was 11 o'clock in the morning. Mum was too scared to let me in. I think more for me than her. I can't count how many times I cried myself to sleep, and I used to wake up sweating with fear from being 8 years old when I heard him coming. I started to have nightmares and then epileptic fits because of him. I can remember when I was 13, I'd had enough, so I left home. I used to climb over the coal yard fence and sleep in the loft. It was frightening. There were fucking hundreds of rats. I'd made friends with the guard dogs. The bitch had had pups one morning. I just got out of the loft to go before they opened up for work, and the bitch was crying, so I went to have a look and the pups were dead. But she was stood up. There was a hole in her, the size of a tennis ball. I could see right inside of her. While I lay in the coal yard, I decided I'd go to my gran's to get something to eat in a bath. She told me that he'd beat my mum up again, so I decided to go back home. I was getting older, and I could take the beatings. When I got home, he was out, and I saw my mum, and she had 2 black eyes and swollen lips. I told her one day I would stop him. She said I was not to say things like that. She said it was okay. But I knew things like that were not okay. The next day I went to me gran's. That's me dad's mum. And she was black and blue. I asked what had happened, but she wouldn't tell me. I thought it was my granddad that had done it, but it wasn't. It was my dad. Her own fucking son. What a piece of shit. He was a no-good fucking bully. He had bashed her for feeding me and letting me have a bath there. I hated him so much by then. It was about that time I started a fight at school. I found it easy. Oh, I could take a punch and can honestly say I never got hurt. As I left school, I used to go to the local dance hall, and all I wanted to do was fight. You know, this might sound daft, but every time I threw a punch, I could see my dad's face and I enjoyed every fight. I went to live with my Auntie Anne and Uncle Joe. They were really good to me. Living with them gave me a taste of normal family life. But it could not stop the need to fight. Perhaps it was just my way of discharging all the pent-up anger and hate I had for my dad. I think my dad pushed me too far. He's dead now, but I can never forgive him for the way he was throughout my life. He was fucking horrible, full stop. I'd never known my dad to ever stand up to any man, but he was okay beating children and women up. The most astonishing thing of all was when I got older, I never hit him, but I almost did a few times from age 16 onwards. Once or twice, I really put it on him, saying, "Come on, you fat cunt." But you know what he used to say to me? He'd say, "I'm too old now, I can't fight." I'll never forget them words he used to say. And my mum stopped me hitting the pig, because she said it would only be worse for her when I wasn't there. I never understood why she stayed with him for the 40-odd years she did. The sad thing is, he left me mum in 1993 for a younger woman. That was how he paid her back for the loyalty she had showed him, even through all the shit he gave the family. To rub salt into the wounds, Mum would have to walk around with weapons on her because she was still scared of me dad. He finally went to hell, aged 74, in 2001, while I was in prison doing 7 years. Hearing of his death didn't affect me whatsoever. Mum lasted only 7 months after Dad had died. I lost both parents on that prison sentence, which I'll go into more further in the book. Today my sisters Anne and Denise hate him, and my brothers Terry and Robert can't even stomach talking about our dad, because they dislike him that much. None of us held it against Mum for standing by him. If anything, we pitied her for what she'd endured. Even my mum's family, including her brother Frankie, was scared of him. If Mum's family upset Dad, he'd often go around threatening to put their windows through. The most terrible thing about my dad was that at the end of his life, no matter how horrible he'd been, he never once said sorry to anybody. He never told me he loved me. When I became too old for him to knock about, he actually tried to pay someone to beat me up. Luckily, the kid who he asked me to beat up came and told me that he'd offered him £200 to do me in. I haven't done this book for you all to feel sorry for me. The reason I'm doing this book, now in my 70s, is to maybe explain the reason of why I was what I was in life. When I was working the doors and fights broke out, I would just never put myself in reverse gear. I just wouldn't do it. In the 90s, I was doing just 2 nights at the raves, but I was getting £500 a shift. That's £1,000 a week for 2 nights because the clubs got what they paid for. I would never back down from anyone, and if I had to fight them, then I would see my dad's face when I fought. I wasn't the toughest man in the world, but I'd never back down from anyone, and this was why. I got beatings many times, but it was just my job. A bricklayer went to work laying bricks, a plumber fixed sinks, and it just so happened I went to work in pubs and clubs and traded punches with people. The greater a child's terror, and the earlier it is experienced, the harder it becomes to develop a strong and healthy sense of self. Nathaniel Brandon.